morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions, those who are today joining us on C-SPAN Network. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy, as I have mentioned, that our cell phones are silenced or turned off. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion and welcoming our special guest is Thomas Spohr. Mr. Spohr is director of our Center for National Defense and the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Prior to joining us here in 2016, he served for over 36 years in the U.S. Army, attaining the rank of general. And to save on time, I will not list your many appointments. I will just introduce General Spohr.
Thank you very much. Need to qualify the record that I retired as a lieutenant general, but thank you for that promotion, John. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for making your way over to Heritage this morning. Recently, the Army has begun to lay out a new vision that includes a priority on modernization programs that deliver on time, a talent management system that incorporates more flexibility, and a focus on improving readiness for high-intensity conflict. All this with the backdrop of the release of the National Defense Strategy, calling for renewed emphasis on great power competition and turning away from a decade and a half of counterinsurgency operations. Finally, thankfully last month, Congress finally provided 2 years of increased and predictable funding, which will allow the military to start rebuilding. To discuss the implications of these events, we're honored to welcome back to Heritage Dr. Mark Esper, the 23rd Secretary of the Army. Secretary Esper was sworn in on November 20th, 2017, giving him just shy of 4 months on the job. Secretary Esper has an extraordinary biography, superbly qualifying him for his current position. Previously served as a vice president at the Raytheon Company. Before that, he held leadership positions in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Aerospace Industries Association. Secretary Esper has had extensive experience working on Capitol Hill, serving as a key advisor to Senators Bill Frist and Chuck Hagel, and in key staff positions on the House Armed Services Committee, Senate Foreign Relations, and Government Affairs Committees. His previous Pentagon experience includes service as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Significantly, Secretary Esper is a Heritage Foundation alumni, having served as our Chief of Staff 20 years ago this year, from 1996 to 1998. In fact, when I mentioned to the former Heritage president, Dr. Ed Fulner, that he was coming back, he was delighted and passed along his best wishes. Near and dear to my heart, Secretary Esper is a former Army officer graduating from the United States Military Academy in 1986 and commissioned infantry. He served in the regular Army for over a decade, including service in the 1991 Gulf War with the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne Division. Following active duty, he continued to serve in the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve before retiring in 2007. Secretary Esper holds a Master of Public Administration from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and a doctorate in public policy from George Washington University. Secretary Esper will speak for about 5 minutes, and then I'll ask him some questions, and then he's agreed to take questions from the audience as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Esper.
General Spohr, thank you very much for that kind and lengthy introduction. You make me feel very old, but I appreciate you hosting this event today and for Heritage hosting it as well. I do want to lay out the basis for my vision that was articulated last week, the Army vision, if you will, and give you an abridged version of the remarks I gave just to set the stage and to facilitate the Q&A session. So, with that, let me step back and give you the historical perspective from which we began this. And you could think about the following. First of all, consider the longest conflict in our nation's history is ongoing. There is tension between defense and domestic spending. Social turbulence and political disharmony divides many. Moscow is expanding its influence and seeking to take advantage of the United States while we're distracted. And at the same time, the Army faces many challenges. We are strained by an unrelenting operational tempo. We're challenged by unpredictable budgets. Our equipment is aging, maintenance costs are increasing, and we've mortgage the future to pay for today, for the readiness. Recruiting is also becoming more difficult. So does all this sound very familiar to you? If it should, if you're old enough, it was 1973, not 2018 that I'm talking about. 1973 was an inflection point for the Army. It faced a number of significant challenges that I've just outlined. We also learned from what happened in the Yom Kippur War of the same year that the nature of conflict was changing. High-intensity battle was back, and there were many lessons learned. In fact, the Army sent teams to study that conflict, much like we've done in past years, in recent years, with regard to Ukraine. But the great leaders at that time, General Creighton Abrams and others, set out a vision for the Army, and it was very simple. Be prepared to fight and win in a high-intensity conflict against the Soviet Union in Europe. And so we built an entire army beginning in 1973 along those same lines. The result was big organizational changes that brought into existence Army Material Command, Forces Command, and TRADOC. And that's relevant because I'll be talking shortly about Army Futures Command. But we also ended up with the major systems of our era, of General Spore's era as well. We had the Big Five weapon systems. We had the concept of airland battle, the National Training Center, and of course the all-volunteer force, which at that time was considered very dubious and uncertain. We didn't know what it would mean for our Army and our country. But we still have that same Army from 1973 today, 45 years later. And in some ways, in many ways, it's showing its age. There were some differences between 1973 and today, 2018. First of all, we have a very supportive Congress. They generously gave us a very good budget in terms of FY18 and FY19, building upon a good increase in FY17 as well. We, the Army, have regained the public trust and respect, probably the most admired government institution in America these days. And we certainly have a very professional, all-volunteer force that has served our nation very, very well now for a few decades. At the same time, the future we face is increasingly uncertain. China and Russia, which have been identified as our strategic competitors as part of this era of great competition that the NDS describes, they are modernizing, they are eroding our overmatch, and they are improving their ability to threaten our interests. As we know, Russia is in eastern Ukraine, Crimea, and Syria, and China is increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea. And we should expect to see the proliferation of their weapons, their tactics, and their technologies by others, whether it's terrorist groups or proxies around the world. We also face the character of war is changing. These challenges reflect everything from speed, lethality, continuous surveillance, disruption of communications and networks, threats in every domain, including cyberspace, information warfare in space, and of course, increased operations on urban terrain. So the Army vision that we developed to win in this new environment outlines a few things we must be able to do differently and better. We have to be ready and able to deploy rapidly. That's not just the regular Army, but that's the Guard and Reserve as well. We have to overcome our adversaries' defenses to make sure that we can access a theater, gain a foothold, maintain that access, and then exploit success. We have to remain mobile, maneuver boldly, and quickly deliver precise, lethal, and overwhelming effects through and across every domain. And we must do all this faster than the enemy. So to achieve the vision I'm going to outline here in a moment, we have to pursue three major lines of effort, in my mind. The first is the evolution and propagation of multi-domain battle concept with regard to the high-end fight and all that will drive. The second is we need a new talent management system that is focused, personnel system that is focused much more on talent management. And third, we need to transform the acquisition system by standing up Army Futures Command. Those three things are critical to achieve this vision, and I'll read it for you. The Army of 2028 will be ready to deploy, fight, and win decisively against any adversary, anytime and anywhere, in a joint, multi-domain, high-intensity conflict, while simultaneously deterring others and maintaining its ability to conduct irregular warfare. And by the way, that last part is different than what it was 45 years ago. Next, the Army will do this through the employment of modern manned and unmanned ground combat vehicles, aircraft, sustainment systems, and weapons, coupled with robust combined arms formations and tactics based on a modern warfighting doctrine and centered on exceptional leaders and soldiers of unmatched lethality. Now, we can parse through that through the Q&A. But that is the basis of the vision going forward. I can outline in exquisite detail what we are doing now with regard to training and manning and organizing, But I know I'm kind of overrunning my time limit here, so I'll just pause right there with that vision, by setting the stage for what brought us to that point, and to tell you that the Army is doing great things these days. We have a great ambition with regard to where we're taking the service, and I remain fully confident that were conflict to happen today, we would prevail and win in any theater of war against any adversary. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to you, General Spoor, for Q&A.
That sounds great, sir. Thank you very much. Well, you were going so fast, I didn't get the whole vision written down, sir. But so I'm looking forward to discussing that more in the coming minutes here. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, we have heard a lot from the leads of your cross-functional teams lately. In fact, I think wouldn't be too far to say they've been relatively chatty in military terms here lately.
Good.
And and I'm sure they're responding to guidance that you're providing them. But and we hear the Army's moving quickly, but even then, the speed is striking, nevertheless. I am just struck by a number of things that the CFTs have said. A first battery of maneuver, short-range air defense systems by 2020. That's 2 years from now. Prototypes of robotic combat vehicles by next year, 2019. And an artillery shell that can go out 40 kilometers by 2020. Again, 2 years from now. These are really remarkable. Typically, when we talk about new things, it is in multiples of 5 years. So 2025, that type of thing. I was very interested in how you personally plan to keep these bold plans from becoming bogged down with unanticipated problems, test schedules, things like that, which typically plague acquisition programs.
Well, it's a great question. I think first and foremost, the leadership has to be committed to these reforms. And so the Chief of Staff and I meet frequently and review the progress on these with regard to the CFTs and in particular projects. We are now reviewing the modernization major defense acquisition programs on a monthly basis. And also we've delegated the important task of standing up Army Futures Command to two great leaders, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, McConville, and the Undersecretary, Ryan McCarthy. And they have driven us very hard, pushed an aggressive schedule that will allow us to stand up the Army Futures Command this summer. And it'll be based on much of the work we've done so far with regard to cross-functional teams, all the progress they are making across our 6 modernization priorities. And much of that has been enabled by some legislative changes that were done by Congress in the past couple NDAAs that allow us to use things such as what's called other transaction authorities that allows us to prototype and bring to the field items much more quickly. But there's much work to be done. We have to continue to reform the processes that are inherent in the current modernization process. And we continue to work on delayering organizations. We've been very successful so far with the cross-functional teams. We reduced the layers from 12 to 3 when it comes to those teams and what they're working. But again, much more needs to be done. At the end of the day, what we need to do, and something I emphasize as I talk to our acquisition folks or other parts of the enterprise, is the importance of speed, the importance of managing risk, taking some risk, and making smart choices that put products over process.
Just to follow up on that, sir, so we are about 6 months into the fiscal year, and the Army and the other services just got their money. Lots of times we build a schedule, for example, a robotic vehicle next year based on our optimistic view of the world. If we get into another situation in 2019 where the money doesn't flow till the third quarter, does that put any of this at risk?
Well, you always have to manage the risk. You're right. We are 6 months into the fiscal year, and we'll see our money soon. That's why we asked for additional flexibility to spend some of that money, and I believe that will be coming. That'll give us a chance. That's mostly O&M money, but with regard to the modernization money, that money is 3-year money, so we have to spend it well. The key, though, is, and I'm assuming that the budget agreement with regard to FY19 will come through, but what we have to do is continue to look beyond 19 because these are multi-year programs in some cases, and make sure that we are doing everything we can internally right now to reform any number of things, processes, how we do service contracts, how we staff our headquarters, because my aim, and it's one of the 3 focus priorities I had coming into this job, is to look everywhere we can to free up time, money, and manpower so that we can put it into these and other priorities. My view is that you So I like to say you fix your roof when it's sunny out, and right now it appears to be sunny for the next couple of years. The natural reaction is for folks is to get back on their heels and relax a little bit, but I'm actually pressing forward, and I want the chief and I and others are pushing for everybody to be on their toes and look for ways we can find savings, because the budget is unpredictable, much like it was in 1973, and so we have to do our best now to find those dollars so we could, again, apply them back to our priorities.
Thank you, sir. So at the end, this is kind of changing gears a little bit. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. Army active component was 780,000 soldiers. In 2017, the active Army was 476,000 soldiers. In 2018, the Army was authorized to grow by 7,500 soldiers to 483,500, and then in the 2019 President's budget, it requests an active duty size of 487,500, growth of another 4,000. So a steady growth in the last couple of years, fairly modest, a 2-year growth of 11,500. It's coming at the same time, and I've heard these voices, maybe you have too, that people in Congress and elsewhere are saying that the services are really going to have a hard time recruiting to these numbers, and that maybe it doesn't even make sense to increase the size of the Army if they can't recruit to it. Variety of factors playing into that. 6 months into 2018, sir, I was wondering how recruiting is looking in 2018 and whether you anticipate the Army being able to recruit what they need to.
It's a very good question. I'll answer it in multiple ways. First of all, we're on track, which is good news, and I'm confident we'll meet our goal. One of the interesting facts is that our retention rates are higher than they've ever been. So that also takes some pressure off the recruiting end of this. I would say the bigger picture is this, is that the vision, when I outlined the vision last week, speaking to the details, what I said is we need to get to be over 500,000 soldiers with appropriate growth, associated growth in the Guard and Reserve, because the supply of troops, of forces, right now is insufficient to meet the demands and to meet the guidance, the DoD guidelines with regard to deployability or deployment versus home station time. So we need to build the end strength. We will continue to grow at a modest pace. It's important that we are able to absorb these soldiers and make sure we get them through the training pipeline. And also importantly, we are maintaining very high standards. We have not lowered our standards, and there's agreement among the leadership is that we will accept a smaller Army if it means not compromising our standards. I've lived through periods where we've dropped the standards a little bit, and you end up at some point paying for it. So there's a unified commitment to not do that, and we intend to maintain, very high standards going forward.
Thank you, sir. Again, changing gears again, the Army, especially when the budget is tight, has a kind of a tumultuous relationship with its Army National Guard component. And the 2019 President's budget increases funding for full-time support personnel for the Guard and the Reserve. It's got funding for 4 National Training Center or CTC rotations for the National Guard, which is, frankly, in my experience, unheard of. And it's got more funding for reserve component soldiers to come on active duty and support combatant command type missions. As a former Guardsman and now the Secretary of the Army, can you speak to the importance of the Guard to the Army mission and what you're doing to make sure that relationship, which has had some ups and downs, remains healthy?
Well, you mentioned one of the things I would begin with, and that is I think one of the benefits I bring to the office is I've served in all 3 components. To include more years in the Guard and Reserve than I spent on active duty, actually. And my Guard time includes service with the Virginia Guard, the 29th Infantry, and of course the DC Guard. So I bring that perspective to the job of a Guardsman, and I know the particular challenges it means of being in either the Guard or Reserve. I will tell you this much, that when I entered the Army, at least active duty in 1986, the Guard was a strategic reserve. And then over the years it became an operational reserve, and now it's an operational unit. The Guard and Reserve have proven themselves exceedingly well in the past 15, 16, 17 years of conflict. And they're currently serving around the world in any number of named operations and other deployments. In fact, when I go around and visit the Army, and before Christmas I had the privilege to go to Afghanistan. I was down in Kandahar being briefed by a brigade combat team. And I did not know it, or would not have known it if they had not told me that sitting at that table was a mixture of regular Guard and Reserve soldiers. And it wasn't until I looked around and saw their shoulder patches that I could figure out that that was indeed the case. It is seamless right now. Everybody brings to the table a lot of skills and different experiences, And I'm very impressed by what I've seen. As I've come back into the Army, as I've traveled, I try to reacquaint myself with the Army and reassess what has happened. And one of the great joys, if you will, is seeing how integrated the Guard, Reserve, and regular Army are right now. It's very impressive. I think it brings to bear the full weight and effectiveness of the total Army. And I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing out there. And I do not see the role of the Guard or the Reserve changing anytime soon.
Following up on that, sir, do you and other Army leaders make a deliberate effort to visit the Guard when you're out and about?
Oh, absolutely. So you said I've been first of all, I've been on the job now 4 months, and I've been out to the National Guard Bureau twice, which is about half the time I spent. I used to go out there monthly when I was on guard duty, so I feel like I'm going back every time I go there. But I've been out there to meet with the tags. I spent an hour or so with them talking, discussing issues, and I was just out there last week walking around NGB with the head of the Army NGB, National Guard, to just chat with soldiers and find out what's on their minds. Then, of course, when we go out, I do try and find soldiers from the Guard and Reserve when I visit the troops out in the field, and I'm always pleasantly surprised, whether it's an aviation unit or soldiers from the Reserve component. In fact, I'm traveling tomorrow to Fort Knox, and I'm going to see a Reserve unit, Reserve aviation unit down to Fort Knox. So I try and make an effort everywhere I go to find those soldiers, to talk to them, find out what's on their mind, because they bring to bear different experiences, but they also have different challenges being a Guardsman or Reservist. I mean, they have employers back home. They have different pay structures and arrangements that need to be sorted out, and so they just bring different challenges as a critical component of the force.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned Futures Command. I know many people are interested about it. I was struck by the announcement, I think it was by your undersecretary, that, or maybe it was you, that Futures Command will be located, quote, in an urban center close to industry and academia. Can you explain why that's important to you, and whether you're getting any interest from American cities across the country to locate your command with them, just like I think the courtship that's going on by U.S. citizens trying to land Amazon's second headquarters?
No, nobody's interested whatsoever. Comparing Futures Command to Amazon is quite a comparison. There is quite a bit of interest, but let me go back to the first part of your question. What we're looking for is cities is the shorthand, but what we know we need, based on how we've structured Army Futures Command, is we need to be located next to where the talent is, and the talent being academia, industry, the centers of innovation around the country, where we can draw on the best people, attract them, bring them into the Futures Command, allow an ecosystem, if you will, to develop, because the purpose of Futures Command will be twofold. It's not just about the modernization enterprise, but it's about having a group of people who can look forward into the future, into the 2030s, 40s, and 50s, and imagine what the threat environment may look like, what the strategic environment may look like, and then think through, how do we adapt to that world? What are the material solutions we need to bring to bear to deal with that? So we need to draw top talent around the country. But then when you get to the materials, the material piece of Army Futures Command, you really need to draw on that top talent, those engineers, those folks who are working on lasers or directed energy or hypersonics, whatever the case may be, to come in and tell you what is the availability of technology, what are the horizons. Too often in the past, one of the shortcomings has been in terms of a major program is we've said that we want these types of requirements, and they were well beyond the reach of what technology was in any reasonable amount of time or money to be spent, and that's why you saw some major failures in the past. One of the things the CrossFunctional Teams is doing now is bringing in all these smart people early. We discuss requirements early on in a small group, and we make reasonable trade-offs at the front end rather than dragging this out over a period of time. So back to location, if we can get somewhere where we can draw some great talent from the civilian side, get them thinking about the future, get them informing us about technology availability, we think that we can drive a better requirements process, and then as a result, have a much more expedited acquisition process so we could build things earlier, and then make reasonable trade-offs and then incrementally grow as we produce items.
Any mayors or states want to talk to you?
Yeah, a lot of folks have expressed interest, and again, we're winnowing down that list based on criteria, and at some point in the coming couple months or so, we'll make an announcement.
Thank you. So staying on this topic of modernization, the relationship between the commander of the New Futures Command and your Assistant Secretary for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. I think a lot of people are fascinated on that because to an outside observer, it almost looks like they're going to be trying to chew on the same piece of bread at the same time. And so can you speak to how you see that relationship and how you think you can keep them in good graces.
Well, we are not changing any of the legal authorities, statutory authorities that are currently involved with regard to the acquisition technology folks. All the lines of command, et cetera, will remain the same. All the authorities, whether it's milestone decision authority, et cetera, will remain with the ACE Assault, with Dr. Bruce Jetty, who's a very capable person that I'm very pleased to have on the team. So all those will reside. What we've done, though, is that the acquisition team, if you will be matrixed into Army Futures Command. If anybody's spent time in industry, you'll know that the industry does this frequently, where you matrix teams in, but they still report back to their senior engineer or their senior lawyer or their senior whatever. But we matrix them in so that we provide a lot of day-to-day coordination, a lot of day-to-day operationalization of what we're trying to achieve with regard to these various technologies. And of course, what we see really is an enhanced role as the PMs and PEOs take have a much more robust presence through the whole stage of the process, whether it's from concept all the way through the material development decision all the way through. And of course, Dr. Jetty will be playing this additional role where he will have a good degree of oversight over the entire Army Futures Command to help that enterprise along as well, providing that civilian oversight piece of it.
Thank you, sir. So you've, getting off acquisition for a moment and modernization, you have mentioned in several forums a desire to change the Army's talent management system, perhaps bringing in some ideas from the private sector. Oftentimes, of course, changing the personnel system involves the very culture of the organization you're trying to deal with, and often encounters resistance. I can think of when Secretary Mabus tried to do away with some, I think they call them ratings or titles in the Navy, and that ran into some troubles. Can you describe what you see as the issues, the challenges with the current system, and maybe some ideas on where you're trying to take this?
Sure. Well, we have a good personnel system now. We produce a great officer and NCO Corps. Again, have served us very well for a long time. We do a great job recruiting folks, but I think we can do better. The mantra is always the needs of the Army, and if the Army wanted you to have this or that, they would have issued you one, so forth and so on. The fact is we have an all-volunteer force. We have since '73, and my view is that you have to re-recruit, well, you say retain, but I think you re-recruit them every day, and how you treat them throughout their career determines whether or not they will stay with you, and if they stay with you, how satisfied they will be, how well they will perform, et cetera. So I think we can do a much better job adopting some of the practices used in the private sector, whereby you start looking at individuals not as square pegs to put into square holes, although we tend to put sometimes square pegs in round holes and vice versa. But how do you identify for each individual their knowledge, their skills, their behaviors and preferences, and try and match that up better, much like a market operates, to meet the needs of the Army? If you can do that, if you could start putting square pegs in square holes, you'd find that you have better outcomes for both the individual and the service, and for the Army. More productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we want to do. To do that, there will require a number of structural changes, process changes. I've had some discussions with the Hill already. They're more than willing to look at how DOPMA and ROPMA need to be reformed. How do we stretch out the 20-year career? How do we allow greater flexibility for example, service members to move in and out of the different components with ease? How do you allow persons to take a break, a sabbatical, if you will, if somebody a woman wants to leave the service for a couple years to raise her family, or the father wants to raise the family, he can come back in and not be penalized for that. If they want to go off and do civil schooling on their own, they can do that and come back in. So how do you create a great deal more flexibility? And this is playing out in real time now as we think about how do we recruit cyber warriors, if you will, because those are unique skill sets that are in quite a lot of demand. So there are a number of things we need to do. Again, a much more flexible, open system. At the end of the day, the needs of the Army will come first, but if we can optimize the system better, I think we'll get better performance. It'll help with retention, it will help with recruiting, and again, a better job satisfaction, if you will, as well.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned this earlier. National Defense Strategy identifies Russia as a revisionist power seeking to undermine the international order, and since 2015, DoD has used OCO Funds, Overseas Contingency Operation Funds, first called the European Reassurance Initiative and now the European Deterrence Initiative, or EDI, to increase readiness and force posture in Europe. The fund has grown substantially. Started out $985 million in 2015, and now $6.5 billion are requested in 19. The Army is the largest recipient of these funds, and they're planning to get 70% if Congress passes it as requested. Can you speak to the importance of these funds and how the 2019s and general funds will be used?
No, those funds are very important for the purposes that you outlined. They both reassure and deter, we believe, and so they're very, very helpful. We use those to conduct operations. We're using them to upgrade Army pre-positioned set of equipment and to build another. We're using it to make sure that we have sufficient forces in theater. So we use them quite extensively. When I was in Europe in January, I had the chance to travel everywhere from Belgium to Germany up to Poland and Ukraine, and certainly in Poland we're using those funds. We're using them to conduct exercises down in Germany. And I met yesterday with the Lithuanian Vice Minister of Defense, and he and I had a conversation about this as well. How beneficial those funds are to performing both those missions purposes, and that is both to reassure our allies, particularly the Poles and those in the Baltics, but also deter any type of bad behavior, if you will.
Okay, thank you. A final question from me, and then we'll turn to the audience. So be thinking of a question. In your first, I think it was your first at least, congressional posture hearing for 2019, March 15th, you and General Milley testified before the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. And at that hearing, General Milley was asked about Army readiness, and General Milley said it had improved substantially, but rather than providing any specific details, he instead offered a classified briefing to the member that was interested. And this is in contrast to the posture hearings in 2017, where there was a lot more detail offered, at least from what we can tell. And so last year, General Allen, the vice, testified that of the 31 brigade combat teams, only 5 were ready. Comes at the same time that the services appear to be much more guarded in their public remarks on readiness and shortcomings. For example, it was pretty well publicized that the Air Force stopped all public outreach until their public affairs team had been retrained, essentially. I was hoping you could speak to the need to strike a balance between providing too much information, maybe giving something away that we ought not to, and the need to keep American citizens informed about the readiness of their military.
No, absolutely. So we do need to strike a balance, and one might say that maybe we had swung too far in one direction in terms of speaking about vulnerabilities or shortcomings or weaknesses. But I think prudence tells us that we should, communicate to the degree that we find that right balance. And certainly, members of Congress, it's very important that we be fully transparent with them, but that we do so in the proper setting. What we don't want to do is to say something or signal something that might change the miscalculation of a potential adversary. And that's a critical factor there, is just making sure we're sending the right signals and not sending any wrong signals that could be misinterpreted. So that's where Congress, as the people's representatives, we can go closed session, really talk in detail about some of the challenges we face here and there, and we can talk to them about authorities we may need or extra budget. But that's a balance we're trying to strike. And we, in the meantime, we will continue to engage with the media and outside groups and forums like this to talk about, what we face to the degree that makes sense.
Thank you, sir. So that ends my questions. I'd love to turn to the audience now. There's a microphone, at least one, probably two. When you do get it, please wait for it because we're broadcasting, and state your name and your organizational affiliation if you have one. Okay, so let's go with you, sir.
My name is Robert Berry, and I'm here just for myself. My question has to do with our technology and whether or not, or to what degree, our adversaries are trying to take or steal our leading technologies. And if you agree with that, then are you satisfied with our effort to mitigate that?
Well, I don't think it's a secret that we have adversaries out there trying to gain intelligence and understand better what we're doing, whether it's from an operational side or a technology side. So it is incumbent upon us to make sure we are doing everything we can to preserve operational security or technological security, whether it's being careful with what we speak about publicly, and certainly with regard to how we guard our networks. So we're putting a lot of money into improving our network security. And as we think about modernization of our technologies, And I've had this conversation, for example, with the cross-functional team leads. It's critical that everything we build these days is hardened for cyber and is resilient for cyber, because that may be one of the ways by which potential adversaries may try to attack us asymmetrically. So that's the world we live in, and we have to be conscious of it, and I think we are pursuing a number of areas to deal with that. I might add, too, to give a shout out to our Army Cyber. The service is really led in this area. I think we built the Army Cybercom. We have an MOS for cyber. We have a soldiers cyber officer corps. We have 42 teams out there currently. We're building 21 more in the Guard and Reserve. So cyber in particular we take very seriously, and we'll continue to do so, not just from a strategic level, but eventually down to the tactical level.
Great. Okay. Yes, sir, with a red necktie. And then to the lady way in the back next, please.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. As has been noted, Congress finally passed an appropriations bill giving you some extra money, but you're already 6 months into the fiscal year. Do you think you'll have time to spend these extra funds that have been allotted for procurement, or do you think you'll have to ask lawmakers for some reprogramming authority to maybe spend some of that money designated for FY18 in FY19?
Well, procurement money is 3-year money, so I think we'll be fine there. The big challenge is the O&M money, where you have less time to spend more money, and I think with some of the additional authorities, flexibility will be given that we aim to make it, and if not, we'll go back next year and have further discussions. There's a lot of support on the Hill to make sure that we have sufficient time to spend the monies appropriated to us, and not just spend it, but spend it well, and making sure that we are good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So.
Hi, I'm a student from Georgetown University, and my major is medical policy. The question I want to ask is, what do you think of recruiting the unemployed or even homeless as a part of military force?
Including who is part of the military force?
The unemployed or even the homeless as a part of the military forces.
Well, the key is, are you eligible to serve? Do you meet the medical qualifications, physical qualifications, et cetera? And it's challenging to join the military. Believe it or not, we have high standards, and one of the challenges that you referenced earlier is we seem to have a shrinking pool of persons eligible to serve. So currently, 29% or so of America's youth between 17 or 24, something like that, is eligible to serve, that meets that criteria, and of those who have the proclivity to do it is less than 5%. So the question would be is, do those demographics meet the requirements to serve, and do they want to serve?
Yes, please. Right there. Yeah, right.
Hi, sir. Ashley Roki with Shepherd Media. Last week at AUSA, there was a lot of talk about future vertical lift, and as a result of the National Defense Strategy, sort of relooking what size aircraft that would be. Are there other examples as you move forward with the Futures Command and modernization programs that you're relooking at this point, and specifically to get after the National Defense Strategy?
Well, I believe the 6 modernization priorities we've outlined, the Army has outlined, beginning with long-range precision fires, it includes next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, et cetera, all the way through to soldier lethality being the 6th, nest very well with the National Defense Strategy. And so we're confident that those 6 priorities will serve us well. The Chief and I and the Vice and the other leadership have taken a blood oath not to change those, because we want to make sure that there's predictability to industry and to our own internal modernization enterprise, that these are the priorities. This is where we're looking for people, both in and out of government, to dedicate their time, their brain power, their investments, if you will, along those priorities. So we're not relooking FVL, if you will, altogether. What we're doing is asking for folks to prototype. In the case of future vertical lift, we have one aircraft has already flown. I think one will fly later this year. But this is where we don't want to get locked into a set of requirements that we can't change. This is a very iterative process where industry comes, they prototype, we experiment, we make trade-offs, and this is a particularly good news story because I think with regard to future vertical lift, industry is committing $3 for every $1 we put in. So it's a great way ahead, the way we want to continue to move forward, and our challenge is to always look at how we can move things to the left, in terms of accelerating the prototyping so we can get to the end state faster. We need to make this leap into the next generation. I said up front that, in 1973, the foundations of the Big Five were in place. When I entered the Army in 1986, of course, we had the Bradley and the Abrams and the Patriot, but those systems, while all upgraded, are decades old, and in some cases have reached the end of incremental upgrades, Bradley being a case in point. So we need to make the leap to the next generation of technologies, and that's why we want to move things left in terms of prototyping and production.
Great. So in the back in the middle there, please.
Hello, sir. Jeff Weber, U.S. Navy. I have a question about the Army's responsible procurement of information technology. Last year, the Army spent millions of dollars on the machine foreign language translation system, which really is nothing more than Google Translate, which I can download to an Android device for free. And to be fair, sir, if Secretary Spencer were here, I'd be asking him why we in the Navy continue to purchase at a greater cost the Phrasolator, which does the same thing. So I'm wondering, what can you do as a secretary to maybe work with the joint services so that we have maybe a more joint procurement system, that we're not as services more kind of stovepiped into our own services for information technology? And maybe if the Defense Digital Service might be a part of that solution, sir.
Yeah, you put a couple things in there. First of all, I'd say that one of the challenges we face in the Army, and I'm sure Secretary Spencer does as well, is while we have identified 6 modernization priorities and our cross-functional teams are racing after those, there's still a large pipeline of things that have been there before my tenure and before his tenure. So one of the things that we're doing is looking very closely at these programs. Army has over 800 and some programs. So we're looking very closely at all those. We've realigned over $1 billion in S&T dollars to focus on our 6 priorities. But we're going to have to go through that list of 800 plus. And as I said, with regard to reform, there are things that are going to be put on the deep burner. There's programs that likely will be ended because either the strategic environment has changed, because we can't afford them, or because we think they're relatively of lower value than other things we need to pursue. So that's one of the challenges there. With regard to the jointness, there are programs that Undersecretary Lord has held at her level, and she's been fantastic, by the way, in terms of implementing the intent of Congress. But, for example, we just talked future vertical lift. That's really held by her right now. And at some point, that program will be divided up. On items like the network, we do crosstalk a good deal, whether at my level, I meet frequently with Secretary Wilson from the Air Force and Secretary Spencer to talk about how we can share technology to make sure that we are joint, that we have all the interfaces correct, so that we don't end up being stovepipe. It's a challenge, but that's one of the cultural things we're trying to push as well.
Yes, sir, right there, please.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai at Heritage Foundation. The President Trump is meeting, speaking of North Korea, they're having a summit that's coming. My question is, are we prepared enough just in case the diplomacy fails? I don't mean to be negative, but just information on your part. Thank you.
Well, I traveled to Korea after the Christmas holidays to visit our troops on the ground. I went up and down the peninsula, met with commanders and met with General Brooks, the combatant commanders. I'm fully confident that the Army will be ready should it come to that.
Sydney.
Hi, sir. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. You mentioned, that you were scouring the 800 programs, and some of those will be cut, and some of those will be killed outright. As you have all these big 6 spin-offs that you're trying to accelerate, I know you've moved around a lot of the S&T money already, but you'll need procurement money in a few years, just as the budget agreement expires. So, where will you find all that money? Are you going to have to ask for a higher top line? Or are you going to have to, accept perhaps cutting in strength has been the traditional solution for, and reversing the current growth? Or can you actually get, some or all of that from, squeezing water from a stone and cutting current programs?
Well, I think, we'll take with regard to requests, we'll take things one step at a time as the environment, whether it's strategic or on the Hill, evolves. But I think we have to do our due diligence. I need to be a good steward of the taxpayers' dollars and make sure that I can free up all the money I can. And it's going to mean cutting programs, freeing money from current programs by either slowing them or killing them, whatever the case may be, to free up money for those other higher priorities. We just can't continue to ramble along funding 800 programs when we have higher priority needs. That's spreading the peanut butter, as we like to say. And I think the days of spreading peanut butter are over. Instead, we're gonna again apply money to our top priorities first, and then we'll continue to move down that priority list until we run out of cash.
Great. Yes, please.
Thank you. Lauren Fish, Center for New American Security. Similar question. Do you have specific concerns about the fiscal year 19 portion of this recent budget deal falling apart and what that would mean for prototypes hitting the field in fiscal year 19 or 20 from Futures Command?
Well, as you're alluding to, there is a 19 budget deal. My experience has been that once a deal is reached, the members tend to abide by it. So I'm hopeful, and we'll continue to message our needs to the Hill. Again, we've been very clear that both the 18 and 19 appropriations bills are very generous and very appreciative. It helps us get back onto the readiness, to the level of readiness we need to be, but it also helps us to begin in making investments in modernization. So I'm going to assume for now that we'll see the 19 come out the way it was planned, and then we'll start working on 20 and 21.
Tony.
Tony Capacity with Bloomberg. What advantages do you see to the JEDI Cloud initiative that DoD is pushing, the multi-billion-dollar contract? What advantages to the Army do you see accruing?
Yeah, I'm not totally fluent on that right now, so I'd have to get back to you on that.
Can I have a second question?
Sure.
You entered the Army in 1986, right after the major spare parts scandals derailed the second Reagan wave of buildup. What does the Army and, frankly, the other services have to do by way of good stewardship to avoid major procurement scandals that could sour the public, the 95% of the public who are not involved with the military on the buildup?
Yeah, well, I don't remember that. I was a young rifle platoon leader focused on my platoon at the time, but the broader question is, yes, we have to be good stewards of the parts process, and I absolutely, because not just because we need to, but because I can't afford to waste money on spare parts, on single buy items. I think as we approach modernization, there are some principles that Dr. Jetty and I and others have discussed. That is the importance of maintaining competition within our major industrial areas, if you will, because competition buys you both better quality and lower prices. And I've seen that from when I worked on the Hill. I saw that certainly when I worked in industry, how much you'd fight if you were in a competition. And so we need to bring that into the fold with regard to what we're doing, and we need to preserve competition as far as we can into the acquisition process. One of the things we're also doing differently is we're thinking through sustainment up front as part of the acquisition process. So when we talk about the cross-functional teams, the sustainers there, we're at least talking about the sustainment there because, as many of you know, you could buy something, but if it takes an incredible amount of dollars on the back end to sustain it, that could eat away your future modernization dollars. So we're very conscious of that as well. So we're trying to think through life cycle costs now in terms as we make buys. So I hope that answers your question.
Other questions? Yes, sir, over in the corner.
Jocelyn Chakunte with the African Diaspora Association. My question is regarding the U.S. troops in Cameroon, Central Africa. Can you tell us a little bit more about their status and the crisis over there?
Yeah, I'm not focused on either of those, so no, I can't.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, up front here.
Hi, Maria Pickering with the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. My question has to do again with procurement. You mentioned other transactional authorities. Mm-hmm. Could you share with us your other ideas on making the acquisition process more efficient?
Well, some of the things I already mentioned is that to us, what we've seen great success so far is the cross-functional teams, which are not bound by which were not necessarily enabled by law, but it's kind of borrowing best practices that we've seen elsewhere. So if you would look at the past acquisition process, or the current acquisition process in some ways, as has been examined by outside groups and experts and the subject of reports like the Decker-Wagner report, what you have is a series where, requirements begin up here, and they go up the chain of command and down, then they go over and up and down, and it's an elongated, months-long, in some cases, years-long process. And everybody changes it everywhere it goes, and so you get this ridiculous requirement where you're trying to build a nuclear-powered tank that can shoot around 10,000 miles, and it can submerge, and So anyways, what we've done now is all those different players, whether it's on the back end with the sustainers, AMC, it's the testers, it's certainly acquisition, it's the contracting, the budget people, all the warfighter is leading. A warfighter is leading this, brings them all together up front, and they sit around and they talk about what the warfighter expresses his or her need, and then they talk about, well, how do we shape that? What do the key requirements look like, and what are the trade-offs we need to make based on the availability of technology, based on the budget, based on, and how would we contract that? How would we test that? All that's done up front, so you get rid of this process. So we're looking at reducing that from what was currently 5 years or so down to 12 months, 18 months. So that's one ways in which we buy the efficiency. Now, then that group stays together during the process and is able to address either issues that emerge, or if new technology presents itself, they have to discuss what's the trade-off there and make those smart trade-offs. But the aim is really not to let the perfect be the enemy of the better. Find a system, build a system that is better than what we anticipate the enemy might be able to field, or the potential adversary might be able to field at the same time. If it's better, that's good, and then we'll build beyond that. As we've talked about, for example, mobile SHORAD, General Spohr mentioned up front, it's being built on a Stryker chassis. It will likely have traditional effectors, interceptors, if you will. But I've been made very clear that we should make sure that as we think about this design, we build in sufficient power, for example, and space within the vehicle to put lasers on it. So as that technology emerges, as it becomes relevant, we can put the vehicles back in, attach the laser, the fire control, all that, and now you have increment 2, if you will, and that's a lot of shorthand right there. But that's what we're trying to build as we think about how do we continuously upgrade, build room for upgrade growth as we go forward.
Well, thank you, sir, and I think that's going to take us to the end of our available time. You've been a wonderful audience, and so I'd ask you to give Secretary Esper a round of applause, and thank you. Secretary Esper is going to have a short session with members of the press and media. I think, Colonel Fox, if you could identify yourself in the back. It's going to be in a conference room back there, so if you're interested in such a session, please kind of accompany Colonel Fox back there, and that'll take place from 11 to 11:15. But again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful day.